I call Catherine Delahunty.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Tēnā koe, tēnā koutou te whare paramata ko tēnei pō. Very pleased to take a first reading speech. There's quite a lot in the bill, which I have read, and there are a few things in the bill that we are very comfortable with. For example, the modernisation of the scholarships for the Pacific Education Foundation and for the Ngārimu VC scholarships. Obviously, those things are useful. But in the main, this bill is a continuation of the privatisation myth of flexibility meme, which is dominating the education system. And it's interesting because parallel to the bill, there's a process going on at the moment which is about consultation of the purpose of education. And what I would love to see in this bill is that, which is not addressing the purpose, it's just a whole lot of fairly conflicting, in some ways confusing amendments. I'd love to see the purpose of education defined myself, and I'd love it to be, and so would the Greens, that the purpose of education is not the myth of choice. It is equity, human development and mutual liberation. But that is a foreign country, Mr Speaker, where children come first. Not about measuring, not about targets, and not about managing a business. So to get down to the specifics of the bill, of which there are quite a few, there are some parts of this that I'm looking forward to the scrutiny at the Select Committee. The joint principles clauses are not necessarily the worst. I'd say the worst clauses are those around home care and after-school care and early childhood, which I'll talk about in a minute. So the joint principle of a number of schools is an idea that might sound very logical in a franchisee kind of spread it around, let's get flexible and see about managing, because this is all about managing, not about children kind of manner. But having spent last year in particular visiting Decile 1 schools and talking to principals, the principals of Decile 1 schools told me that they were passionate to stay there in that specific community with that specific school to support those communities who are suffering from major inequality, and they were needed to be there every single day. And they did not want to spread themselves around. They wanted to stay there for that community and be there every single day, because the principle is where the buck stops when things melt down, when communities are suffering from poverty, transience and social stress. That's why a principal needs to be there with their school. There may be situations, for example, in rural areas where there are very small schools where you might argue that as long as you've got an excellent teacher or two, you can share the principalship. That needs to have safeguards and it needs to be spelled out. So if there were safeguards and it was spelled out properly, we might consider it, but right now, no. And we would be interested in that debate to take place at the Select Committee. The Minister talked about these principles, these very high-performing, sounds a bit like a sort of type of sport, interesting career path. I think for those at the front line of where education is critical, which is every school, and particularly schools where communities are under stress, it's interesting enough. What they actually need is the ability to focus on their community and to be accountable to that community. But the issue that most concerns us in the bill is the changes to the home care and after-school care provisions. Because home care, Mr Speaker, was already a concern. Home care was a concern because there was a review that got dropped into the quality of it. And as earlier speakers have said, some home care is extremely successful. I'm thinking about some of the Pacific models in Porirua, working with the Wellington Kindergarten, but there are also others where we are very concerned what's happening. And this bill will make it worse, because now the home care industry, if you like, can actually include after-school care for children, and they are allowed to have up to 6 of those children, excluding the person themselves' children. So if that person has up to 4 to 5 children themselves, they can have another 6 in their home with one adult who may or may not be trained, and that will be sufficient to give them the right to be called a service and to have a licensed home-based service. There is not enough protection in this bill to make sure that expanding from early childhood to including after-school care into one service is actually going to be protecting the ratios that are so critical. So at the moment, you're not supposed to exceed more than 4 per home, but in section 31.7a, while children are receiving the service, the total number of children aged 13 or younger, because now it's about older children as well, in the home are there other than the children of the educator must not exceed 6. So we've got this, absolutely, these children of the educator, not counted, they don't matter. We can have a number of those plus another 6 children. And that's why I call it a business bill, because this is about facilitating the opening up of the early childhood home care industry to after-school care without putting the kids first, without saying there has to be quality, without putting ratios that would be expected normally across the early child service. It is all about making money. It is not about children. And it's objectionable to do that when we know that early childhood, much of it is not meeting the standards required for actually supporting children's development. The Ministry of Education said that, not me. So there's a lot of work to be done, and we will be opposing this bill primarily because we believe this is creating a lack of safety and risk. It's very, very serious. That's the serious point. We'd like to see some discussion at the Select Committee about the student number and its efficacy. Some people, and I'm not saying that the Greens agree with them, want us to have a look into this one because of how student numbers are used in early childhood to actually try and dob in beneficiaries and force their children into sometimes inappropriate care. But we don't think this is necessarily going to be a problem with this. The school hours, flexibility does currently exist, so why do we need to change this? There's a little clue as to why this is being put in the bill. That clue is called so parents can work longer hours and kids in schools. And so the Green Party is not romantically for flexibility or romantically against it, Mr. Seymour. It's not ideological. It's about what will work best for kids. What is important is, do we need a legal change here? Is it necessary to change the law? What about school transport? What about parents with kids going to different schools? Flexibility lives in, it's a universe that people don't actually live in. It's a universe of theory that everything is just wide open out there. And flexibility already does exist in some schools, and we support what's happening already. So we do not think it needs to go further at this point in time. When it comes to charters, these enabling clauses do concern us. We are not here to enable a continuation of charter schools. And interesting, I just read the PhD work of a Crawford University policy study in Australia that looks at the charters so far, and you'd have to say you wouldn't want to enable more because the conclusions of this research were very interesting. That it kind of went, charter schools, New Zealand, no, not necessarily better, not necessarily worse, not necessarily anything really, just kind of like state schools. And then the most interesting part, Mr. Speaker, is the wellbeing study of the children. And the children themselves said at the beginning of their term in the new charter school, 84% said their life was good, and by term 3, 59% said the same. They had dropped that much. And you see that if you look at their figures, and if you look at the statistics on the literacy achievements, you see that the schools at best keep up with the state schools, or at worst they drop by. So it shows you that when independent people from other countries start researching our models that exist so far, they find that there's a problem. So there are these issues with the tertiary institutions being expanded to run charters as well. It really concerns me that we would assume that private training education institutes know more about teaching than school teachers, and that we need to allow these people whose pedagogy is focused on older people, they're focused on the older end of the education system, that they're going to be the people to really make a difference. So without accountability, without the OIA, without ombudsman, these people who are not focus on the pedagogy of how children learn, they'll be our pedagogy. They will be able to do that. And having just been part of the inquiry on special needs, I just wonder, because they're falling through the cracks now. So what's going to happen if there is more of a training focus and less of a whole child focus in education? It's really concerning that we would allow that to happen. And it might be great from a business point of view, yeah, make more money if you want to, but actually is completely not typical. The wānanga of Aotearoa is not typical of other trading organisations. So I oppose this because I don't believe it's correct. So we'll be having a lot more discussion about this, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much. Tēnā koutou.